Oh, I wanted to tell him I got it. Emma?
Oh, they charge gas by the
Yeah,
pound.
had to reach the.
Welcome, everybody, to our Wednesday morning study session. We hope you are doing well. We're excited to be back. Sorry about last week. I had forgotten I had a conference I was going to. So this week we're going to talk about, it's funny enough, the guy, Jonathan, hopefully will come on because he's the one who wanted to talk a little bit about this. We're going to talk about the Maccabi Games and a little bit of Jewish history and sports. So we all, of course, remember the famous scene from Airplane in which they ask if anybody would like anything to read. And somebody says, yes, I'd like to read something on the history of Jewish sports. And they give them a little pamphlet for Jewish athletes.
I
Remember
don't
that scene?
remember that.
It's a hilarious scene. So we're going to debunk that myth today as we talk about the great Jewish athletes, but also talk about the Maccabi Games, which of course is a very prominent piece of our world. So we'll start with that. And I don't think there's any misconceptions as to the origins of the Maccabi Games. We're talking about the ones, and obviously they start because of the Olympics. So the Olympics started, of course, at the end of the 19th century. And by 1932, there were, of course, a lot of Jews now who were living in Israel, and it had become prominent to be in shape, kind of like in America during World War II. And so the idea was, can we create a multi-sport event here in Israel? And interestingly enough, the British said yes. Now we have to remember the British were not very excited about Jews generally living there, but in 1929, it was asked of them if they would allow a Olympic style games for just Jews. And they said yes again. And in 1932, in March, they started the Maccabi Games in Tel Aviv at Maccabi Stadium. Interestingly enough, as with so many other things, they finished the stadium the day before. So the day before, kind of like what they seem to do at every Olympics nowadays, there's always seem to be finishing it off at the last second. So they finished off and 400 athletes from 18 countries came, and they had the Olympics. It was quite incredible. Does anybody know who won in terms of the delegation? Which delegation won?
The home team.
Not the home team. It was the place where there were the most Jews, and that was Poland. Poland won.
Oh my gosh.
Remember, this is pre-war where there are more Jews in Poland than anywhere else. So the Polish delegation won, and they were able to have a second Maccabi Games, even though Britain did not want them to have one. They had one in 1935. Originally, it was every 3 years, and they tripled the number of people coming and had over 1,200 athletes, and it was a pretty big success. However, as you can imagine, they didn't have the Maccabi Games the next couple of years. In 1938, the British finally said, no, we're not going to allow, because at this point there was the Jewish illegal immigration had really started to had started to really become prominent. And the British government was afraid that there'd be all these Jews who would illegally go there or legally go there and just stay. And so, and obviously they didn't have it during World War II. They didn't have it until after the Independence War. And then they did the fourth one finally and decided it would take place every 4 years. So the fourth one started in, of course, the 1950s. And it's been every 4 years pretty much since. It is the year after, I believe, the Olympics. So we'll never, double up with the Olympics. Plus, obviously, you don't want to have an Olympic year because you won't. And if it's an off year, then you can also get some of the great, not only regular Jewish athletes like me, but some of the great ones would be able to come as well. I remember a friend of mine, Lauren Shalinsky, was telling me his brother went to participate in the Maccabi games in tennis. And in the first round, he had to play Shlomo Glickstein. I think I told this story. And so his brother was, even though his brother, Shlomo Glickstein, I think at the time was a top 30 player in the world.
Yeah.
So he was a really good player. And my friend, his brother was just so excited, even though he knew he was going to lose, that he got to play Shlomo Glickstein in the Maccabi games. Yes, Flossie.
Do you have to be Jewish, or is it just one parent can be Jewish, or you want to play with them? How can you be admitted?
Well, I think you can be Jewish or converted to Jewish. So anyone who is Jewish, now, how did they do those standards? Nowadays, I think they've become a little bit more lenient on them. You basically just have to be Jewish. I don't know if you have to show more than do more than say you're Jewish. I don't know how they prove it, because I think it is less. Remember, these athletes are not immigrating to Israel, so you don't have the problems with the immigration and the ultra-Orthodox, which is now lessened quite a bit. So, but things have changed quite a bit. For instance, Birthright, you guys, of course, all heard of Birthright, 750,000 Jews, I think, have gone there. Originally, you had to have a Jewish mother. Now, if you identify as a Jew in a multitude of ways, you can go to Birthright. It's really quite lenient. So I imagine that's a good question. How are they determining that? I'd have to check that out. I do know you can be someone who's converted, or you can be someone who is obviously born. They also tried the Jewish Winter Olympics twice. They weren't that successful. Obviously, they could be in Israel. And so, although it's funny enough, I think last Olympics or the ones before in Israel, the Maccabi Games, they added ice hockey. But obviously, you can't do all of the Olympic type style games in the winter. So they tried it twice in Poland and the Czechoslovakia at the time, and it didn't really work. But they did try it, and I think the second time was better than the first, because I don't think Poland was very happy to host a Jewish Olympics in the early 30s. So now it's modeled after the the Olympic Games. So there's a ceremony at the beginning where all the delegations come in. They'll have their flag. It's in order alphabetically, according to how it is in Hebrew.
Oh, really?
Obviously, the two biggest delegations are Israel and America, and I think Israel usually wins, but America usually comes in second. I'm sure America's, and they're now held in Ramat Gan. So many years they were held in Ramat Gan. They were moved to Jerusalem, to the Teddy Stadium, which is named after Teddy Kollek, who is the former mayor. So it's now usually in Ramat Gan, although it was for a couple of years in Jerusalem. They have very similar stuff. They have famous Jewish singers who write songs for it, just like they do. In fact, it was actually for the World Cup one year, they had what's his name? Matthias Yahu wrote the song for the World Cup, a famous Jewish reggae singer. But it is actually the third largest sporting event in the world. They get 10,000 athletes. Usually it's only the Olympics and the World Cup that are bigger in terms of athletes. Sometimes I think it used to be the Pan American Games were bigger. I'm not sure if they are anymore, but I think the Maccabi Games are now the third largest sports event in the world, obviously every 4 years. Now, they are also not just for famous or the best athletes. There is, if you go there, you can compete. There's 4 categories. You have the youth, you have the seniors, you have the para, and then you have the best athletes are in the major category. So my friend, for instance, somehow slipped into the major tennis category. I don't remember if he won 6-0, 6-0, or he lost 6-0, 6-0, or 6-0, 6-1. I just know his brother told me how excited he was to play in the stadium in front of all those people and get completely annihilated by a professional tennis player who was, he may not be in his prime or close to his prime. So it continues to be a huge event. Obviously, it is a very big thing for the Jewish world. Obviously, the closing ceremonies where everybody comes, then they do dances and stuff, and everybody kind of hugs together, modeled after the Olympics. So it's really, I mean, they've had their tragedies. Obviously, we had the bridge tragedy a few years ago. I don't know if you remember about that, but the bridge collapsed, and I don't remember how many people went in the water. A lot of people, probably thousands, went in the water, and I think 4 or 5 people died. But except for that, and at times, they've really encouraged Jewish athletes and Jewish major famous people to come during times of political issues when they thought a lot of people wouldn't come, to try and encourage people to do that. Now, there have been quite a few famous and really terrific Jewish athletes. That's one of the reasons, obviously, they do it in the off year, who have participated. I mean, big time ones. They had Lenny Kratzelberg, of course, even more famous than him, Mark Spitz. Some of the other athletes, Mitch Gaylord, who was, of course, a famous gymnast. Agnes Coletti, who we'll talk about, is probably the most famous Jewish gymnast and one of the greatest Jewish athletes. Carrie Strug participated. For basketball fans, Larry Brown and Nat Holman.
Oh, yeah.
And Dolph Shaves, for those of you who know that, and Dolph's son Danny also participated. Lillian Copeland, one of the greatest Jewish, probably the greatest Jewish track and field female athlete. And tennis-wise, Nicholas Massou, who won the Olympic gold medal. Dick Savit, of course, who was he won the U.S. Open before it was the U.S. Open. It was the 50s, and Brad Gilbert. Isaac Berger, we'll talk about, one of the greats, the greatest probably Jewish weightlifter of all time. We'll talk about him. He has a special connection to the Maccabi Games. He did something there that has not been done since. But a lot of Olympic athletes in various other, not as famous, the events are added over the years, and more continue to be added. The Olympics, there's always that controversy about how events are taken out and put in, and to get into the Olympics, it takes 500 years of applications and begging and bribery. Israel is very lenient. If you can get, I think, 4 delegations with a certain number of athletes to want an event, they will put it in. So, for instance, they had karate, which I don't know if is an Olympic sport. I don't think it's an Olympic sport. They got that. Chess, which obviously probably had more than just 4 delegations. I think they added ice hockey because they had a couple of Jewish Canadian ice hockey players who may have won, I think, went to the Olympics as well, and maybe even won a gold medal if they were Canada. They added cricket. One of the games I not heard about was something called netball. I forgot to look up what it was. But so it's not just the very famous ones, but it's some of the less famous ones. I'm sure if they had the Winter Olympics, they would have probably been the first team to add curling. But since it's so famous now, and everybody asks about curling, they also do a lot of, the Paralympics have been part of it since very early on. And so they do all those, and they actually do it at the same time. So whereas I believe at the same time, so we're like the Olympics, as soon as the Olympics are over, they go right to the Paralympics afterwards. Where in Israel, I think they do it simultaneously. Although a lot of the events, like they'll have the opening ceremonies in Israel, but some of the events have started a week or 2 before even, because it may take a long time, like golf and some sports that take a long time to complete. They'll actually start before that may even happen in the regular Olympics as well. And so, games like squash, and obviously games like judo, which Israel is very noted for doing in the Olympic Games. So has anybody here been to them? Because I have not. And then we'll talk about the JCC ones. Flossie, you've been to the Olympics, or you had a question?
They don't play on Shabbat?
They don't play on Shabbat, I don't believe, no.
Okay,
No,
so
of course, they don't run buses either.
well,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends. Like if you're in Tel Aviv, they have buses in Tel Aviv on Shabbat. Some places do, and it's becoming more and more evident that that number will increase. When they were in Jerusalem, they did not.
yeah.
So, but I think they probably all prefer to be in Tel Aviv because, on Saturday you can go to the beach and go do stuff at night. But that would be just my guess. They do have, again, women's athletics as well, which that I'm sure that has not always been, something people in Jerusalem wanted to see, to say the least. So any questions about that? And again, hopefully I'll get to go there one year. It'll just be more coincidental, I think, probably than anything else. But again, it's just a great place. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I wanted to
Larry.
just make a couple of comments.
Please.
I had picked up this book when I was in New Jersey at one of the libraries.
Oh, really? Oh, by Ron Kaplan. That's the famous book. Yep.
Yeah, and it's a pretty interesting book, and it goes back, as you say, into the history of it and how it started with some of the sports clubs. I think you had even mentioned that some of the sports clubs in Poland and other places, like turn of the century, Jewish fitness was not always at the prime, though it was mentioned actually in some of the Zionist meetings, the early Zionist meetings.
Yeah. In that world, in the Zionist world, it was very important.
Yeah, and that, even though it took 30 years, it is unusual that they started in 32, because 32, there was also an Olympics in LA,
Right.
Which was a World Olympics, which happened to be the same year. As you said, they usually try not to have it, but and 32 was kind of a depression year. And 32 was supposed to be the major Olympic event, Hollywood style, bringing out
Right.
the Americans and things like this. But because of the World Depression, very few athletes came in 32 actually to the American Olympics and things like this. But the Germans used the 32 Olympics. They went to it.
The 30.
And then they saw what happened in 32, right. And they said, yeah, we could really outdo it. And in 36, they decided to outdo what the Americans had originally planned to do in 32, but weren't able to because of the Depression. And they built all these giant stadiums and things like this for the 36 Olympics. But the thing that I wanted to mention also was that he mentions in the book something that's interesting, is that if you're able to compete in more than one event in the early Olympics, you got favoritism. They didn't necessarily pick the best athletes, but because of costs and because the whole thing is privately subsidized, or you have to subsidize it yourself. There's no right. government funding for it. You still have to pay your own way, I think. He said that, very few people could afford to even go. And if they got a team sponsorship, strangely enough, CCNY, which is where school I graduated from, had most of the swimming team, and you mentioned Nat Holman, who was the CCNY coach for basketball. But a lot of those athletes went, but you got preference if you could perform in multiple events because it was cheaper. So even if you weren't the best athlete, because if you could perform in multiple events, and then even the coaches, like on the front cover of this book, you see a black fella there. That's the guy who won the decathlon. I forget his name now, but he was one of the coaches. And Canada had a coach who was not Jewish. Obviously, he's not Jewish. Not obviously, but he's not Jewish either. Rayford Johnson. I'm sorry, I was thinking of his name.
I couldn't remember it either. But
Canada had a coach for basketball in the year that they won the championship. Usually the Americans beat the Israelis in the championship game, or Czechoslovakia, or one of the countries, but Canada happened to win it. He wasn't Jewish, but he had been married to a Jewish woman. But it's strange that you mentioned the bridge collapse. I just wanted to read one of the last Olympics. These were letters to the editors. And these were their letters about the Olympics. And it says, one writer complained about a photo of the US team appearing on the front page rather than the Israeli hosts. Another was disgusted and left with sour taste by the rehiring convicted criminals responsible for the 1997 Maccabiah Bridge collapse. It displays the nepotism and favoritism that are well known throughout Israeli society. A third enumerated several complaints that the writer hoped would be addressed for the 2017 event, including a better sound system, better deportment, marching by athletes to reduce the time for their entrance. The writer also called for better transportation to and from the stadium, shorter speeches by the Israeli dignitaries, and perhaps most important, cleaner restrooms. So it's still not. And if we saw the march the other day, into the Olympics, you could see that takes a long period of time. But it is strange. But in the medal count in that particular year, Israel won 461 medals, and second was the United States with 175. So Israel has dominated. Usually,
they always have the biggest delegation too, and also athletes who went to see the restrooms in Israel in 2017. Now, if they're in China, are probably wishing they had those restrooms. So apparently, the Olympic Village in China is terrible. That's all I've heard about. So, and again, it is an incredible thing to have this type of athletic venue for us to just kind of hang out. And because of it, obviously, we added the JCC Maccabi Games in America. Now, this, of course, is for the youth, and were founded in 1982. It got so popular that they didn't host them anymore, starting, I think, in 85 in one place. They would have several cities, usually I think it's 6 cities, and you would go regionally to the closest one, and they get thousands of athletes, Jewish athletes who are teenagers, participating, but not only in sports, but there's music, there's all these other things for people who aren't athletes, arts, and so it's not just athletes who go and compete, it's everyone, and it's really obviously people want to win, but really they promote the spirit of being a good athlete, supportive of everybody else, not trash talking. I've actually volunteered at a couple of them, and it's a lot of fun to see all these Jewish kids coming together, having a good time, some participating in sports, some are there to do other things, some are just being supportive and watching their siblings, and it's just incredible time. So I got to volunteer at it twice in Houston and once in Dallas. And
what did you do as a volunteer?
You just go wherever they tell you to do. My favorite was the year I was a rabbi in Houston. I was in charge of getting a shofar blower who was a rabbi at every opening of every competition.
They said in the book one of the big problems was getting kosher meals for everybody.
Yeah, that's always a problem too.
They have kosher meals at the US at the JCC Maccabiah games.
They have to have them, I think, and they have to be optional. I think they have to be available. I don't think it's always required anymore, but I'm not sure. But what was really interesting is I set up all of the shofar blowers. They wanted rabbis, so all the Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and so forth rabbis, got them all together. And the Chabad rabbi could only do it at a certain time of day, and there was only one competition at that time. So I just put him down for that, and he gets there, and it's the women's dance competition.
Oh God!
So he gets there, and there's all these women in leotards and skimpy outfits. And he thought I did it intentionally to him, which I would have if I would have known what I was doing, but I just put it there because of the time, but I would have done it intentionally, and he knows it. That's why he thought I did it intentionally, because he knew me. So he was a friend, but I thought that was pretty. He still did it. He still blew the shofar, and then he quietly exited immediately afterwards. He may not have been a Chabad rabbi. He may have been just an Orthodox rabbi, but part of the Kollel I knew. So it's been a big part of the Jewish world. You get thousands of teens I think almost every year. I think they do it every year now, every other year. And I'm not counting COVID. I don't know what they're doing now. And the same thing, Maccabi is in Israel's every 4 years. So, and it's pretty exciting. And of course, I'd say a very high percentage of the top Jewish athletes performed in the youth Maccabi games when they were growing up. I'd say a very high percentage. Now, let's talk about some athletes. Now, even though we all know the joke about the Jewish pamphlets, there have been Jewish athletes, hard to believe, through the years who have been very good and even great. And we're going to go through some of them. And I know some of you have heard some of them, and we'll go through most of the popular ones, but I'll talk about Isaac Berger first because he connects. Does anybody know he is the only athlete at the Maccabi games in Israel to do this? Does anybody know?
He's Orthodox. He does payas curling.
Huh?
I said he's Orthodox. He is in the payas curling event.
Payas curling event. He is the only athlete to set a world record at the Maccabi games.
Oh,
Yeah. And so that's why, he lifted, he lifted whatever the weight was. He was obviously was one of the smaller weightlifters, but he set a world record in weightlifting there. So I think he was the first, what is it? I looked that up to see what it was. He was the first featherweight to lift more than 800 pounds. And
Berger.
And he set the record for the press, how much weight was pressed at one time. So, and that was at the 1957 Maccabi games. So he actually won a gold medal. He had 8 world records, and he went to 3 Olympics, and he won 1 gold and 2 silver medals. So he was a prominent weightlifter in the 50s. And he won several world champions, and I think he was the first of his weight class to lift double his weight, which is not an easy thing to do, especially for those of us after COVID when our weight has already doubled anyway. So I could probably bench press my weight in high school, but I couldn't bench press my weight today. So, but there's obviously a lot of famous Jewish athletes. And before we get to the truly great ones, I'm going to go over, of course, my favorite and the most interesting one. We talked about Mo Berger already, didn't we?
Yeah.
catcher.
Catcher.
Yeah. So obviously he is
And a spy.
The spy. He went to, one of the few college graduates who played in the major leagues. He went to Princeton, went to Columbia Law School, played for 15 seasons, and was a good baseball player. None of them. Casey Stengel said he was the strangest man to ever play baseball. Obviously, he became famous because he went on those trips to Japan. We'd send baseball players to Japan because obviously baseball was very popular in Japan. And every year we'd send players like Babe Ruth, Hank Greenberg and Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig actually did go. Who else did we send? Players like just basically the best players of the age.
And Mo Berg.
So he was the one who did take photographs of the Japanese skyline that were used after the war. He did do some help in bringing Nazi scientists over to our side to develop the nuclear bombs and other things afterwards, including rockets. However, he was kind of a really strange guy. And even though he was a genius and, he spoke so many languages and he was a lawyer and he had done all these interesting things, he really was not a very successful person in terms of his profession. I mean, he basically, after the war and after he finished baseball, I think he just lived with his brother or his sister in their garage for the rest of his life, going from one to the other, never really working. Once in a while, he'd coax the US government to help give him money to do something, but he was kind of like a guy who would just sit in, then go around and tell stories and read books. So he never really had a profession that much compared to, we think of what he did, and he's become famous. But he was probably the brother that you were like, oh my God, he's coming to my house. He's going to be here for 5 years. So that was it. So some of the baseball players who went were Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Early Combs, who was of course with the Yankees as well. So a lot of Ray Schalk, who was the catcher for Chicago White Sox, but was not implicated. And the lefty O'Doul, for those of you who don't know him, of course, one of the greats. Walter Johnson went on one of those trips to Japan. Lefty Gomez went, Charlie Gehringer, Jimmy Fox. So these are really the best of the best. So again, once his career in baseball was over, he kind of just did his own thing until he died. And so, and he died in 1972. So he I think he wrote a book, I think he wrote maybe a book or two, but that was it. So his interesting life really turned out to be the last 20 years of his life, just telling stories about his earlier life. Stuart.
Apropos of baseball, we have some real baseball fans here. I want to throw out two baseball names, Jewish, and see if they know who they are. Jacob Steinmetz and Ailey Klingman.
I don't think I know either one of them.
This year.
I don't know current baseball. So if they're baseball players today, I won't know. I only know history. Are they playing today?
They really are current. These two men were drafted into the professional baseball this year, and they are the first identified Orthodox Jews ever drafted. Now, there may have been some really early when there was name changing going on. Steinmetz is a pitcher, and he said he will pitch Friday night, Saturday, etc. However, he is insisting on being able to walk to the ballpark that they're going to be in.
Interesting.
And Ailey Klingman, who I think must be maybe a pitcher also, will not play on Shabbos.
And that's amazing.
That's assuming they get up to the majors. I don't know. Steinmetz was an early draft. I think he's got a good shot. He was third round.
Interesting. So we'll see. But again, for baseball, there have been a wide range of baseball players through the years. Obviously, the two in history right now, again, Ryan Braun, who is a player today, but historically, the best two baseball players of all time are Sandy Koufax and Hank Greenberg. So those are two Hall of Famers. Both would not. Hank Greenberg did play in the World Series on Yom Kippur, and Sandy Koufax did not. Does anybody know the reason Hank Greenberg played on Yom Kippur? It was in 1935 Detroit, and baseball was the only sport. There were no sports that even compared to baseball in the 30s. And he went to local rabbis to ask if he should play. And he also, it was also a playoff game, like a game late in the season to determine if they even went to the World Series. And all the rabbis said, you need to play. They were afraid if he didn't play and they lost, there would be riots against the Jews.
Right.
That's why he did play. Sandy Koufax, now obviously we talked about preferred. Sandy Koufax didn't play, which came into one of my favorite all-time sports quotes, because Don Drysdale, who was also a Hall of Fame pitcher, pitched the first game of the World Series and got shellacked. I think he gave up 6 runs, and in the second inning was taken out. And when was it Walter Austin? I think at the time, so Walter Austin went up to him and to take him out of the game. What he said to him, "I bet you wish I was Jewish today too." And that's what he said as he walked off the mound. So that's a legendary. But there were others. Hank Greenberg obviously probably is the better one, because Sandy Koufax was great for 5 years. He was the best pitcher in history, probably for a 5-year period. Hank Greenberg was the dominant player in the 30s up to 41. He took over from Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and Jimmy Fox as the best player in baseball. He probably would have taken over the home run record because he hit 58. But as soon as he got to 58, the entire league decided not to pitch to him. So he didn't see another pitch for the last 10 games. They just walked him, which I think he ended up setting the record for walks that season, which was broken later by, I think, Barry Bonds. But
Rabbi, there was with that boycott of the pitching, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in that one too.
Yeah, there were a lot. And so
And you're right about Hank Greenberg with the World Series. It was real danger of a riot. In the 30s, of course, it was the rise of Nazism in Europe too. And yeah, that was a real issue in those days.
And there's a great documentary on him. It won, I think it may have been nominated for an Academy Award, The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg.
Yeah.
But incredible player. He would have been even better, but he was the first baseball player to volunteer for the draft after Pearl Harbor. And he spent 5 full years in World War II. So he lost 5 seasons in his prime. There's only a couple baseball players who were the greatest of their age, who lost 5 seasons. One was Ted Williams. Had Hank Greenberg and Bob Feller. Those are the 3 that really were impacted. Ted Williams, it was right at the beginning of his career. So he actually played all the way to 1960. But for Feller, it was also in the beginning of his career. But he lost 5 years of his prime. Basically, Bob Feller was not Jewish, led the league, I think, in strikeouts, ERA, and wins the 2 seasons before World War II and the season after World War II. And then kind of felt, but Hank Greenberg still is a first Hall of Famer and probably would have had a lot of records. I think he had the record. I think he still owns the record for most RBIs for the American League. And he was basically the MVP in 1940 and the MVP in 1946.
Wow.
So basically he lost 5 years where he probably would have won MVP several times and led the league in home runs. So he probably would have ended up number 2 all time in home runs to Babe Ruth. This obviously is before Hank Aaron.
All right.
Now,
Rabbi,
yes.
I'm sorry, just a quick note, although not Jewish, of course. Ted Williams actually got 2 wars because he was also in the Korean War. So
he was not happy about being drafted. They were short on bombers for the Korean War, and he had to take 2 years out. He only served 3 years in World War II, but he was a bomber, which obviously even surviving as a pilot during all those missions, I mean, very rare. And then he had 2 more years in Korea, and he was not happy to be drafted again because he was obviously older and had already served, but they made him serve 2 more years. If he had been Joe DiMaggio, they wouldn't have done it because it would have been, Joe DiMaggio was so beloved and Ted Williams was not, to say the least. Sandy Koufax obviously is the greatest Jewish pitcher. He was basically the best pitcher in Major League history for 5 years. Those 5 years, he won 3 Cy Youngs, but of course, those years they only gave Cy Youngs to 1 pitcher. His last year, he was completely dominant, but his doctor said, if you pitch anymore, you're going to lose the use of your left hand, your left arm. So if he had been around 30 years later, they would have just done surgery. He would have been fine. So he retired at 32. So he had like 8 years where he was really wild, and you probably were really scared to go against him because he might kill you. And then he was just totally dominant for 5 years. So those are the 2 considered by many to be the best athletes all time. There are also many other great baseball players. Al Rosen, who was of course he was a third baseman for the Indians, for those of you who don't know, the Triple Crown is leading the league in batting, home runs, and RBIs, and he was 0.001 percentage points away from doing it.
Right.
He almost did it. So, but there was a lot of other baseball players through the years, some very prominent, most of them just pretty good players. But those are definitely the most famous until Ryan Braun, but I am not very familiar about him because I stopped paying attention to baseball players. So, but you have others like Sean Green, who was a great player for a while with Los Angeles, and Holtzman, who was an excellent pitcher in the 70s and late 60s. So there's been some other ones. The catcher for the famous Chicago Cubs of the early 1900s was Jewish. I just forgot his name, but you have ever heard of Tinker to Evers to Chance?
Chance, right.
Well, the catcher of that group, who's not mentioned in that, was Jewish. Also, Obviously, Arnold Rothstein, who tried to rig
Ah,
the 1919 World Series, actually did rig it. Sorry, he did do it. He was Jewish. What a lot of people don't know is one of his henchmen was Jewish. His name was Abe Attel or Abe Attel. I still don't know. Why was that so interesting? Because he was a former boxing champion. He's one of the greatest Jewish boxers, one of the great boxers of all time, and he was one of the henchmen for Arthur Rothstein. And so we'll go into boxing because although there were a lot of good Jewish baseball players, they were never anybody. There was never a dominance in baseball. They did have Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax, and we really were the only two baseball players to ever totally dominate. Boxing, there were a lot of dominant boxers from the early 1900s all the way to the 1930s. And because obviously it was an area where you could do it. There were no restrictions for boxers except for maybe heavyweights. Michael.
Just before you get to boxing, I just wanted to tell this story, which I don't remember the entire story, but a couple of baseball players that we haven't mentioned, they weren't great players. Norm and Larry Sherry were brothers, and I think one was a pitcher and one was a catcher.
Barry was a pitcher for one of the New York teams.
Dodgers, I think.
I think so, but I'm not
There's
positive.
I think
story.
sure.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I think they'd one played for those.
I read the story that one game, and I don't know whether it was on Rosh Hashanah or between the holidays. So I think one of them was pitching, the other one was catching him, and the umpire was also Jewish, and they when the game started, they just kind of turned to each other and said Lashana Tova. And, it's probably the only time that's been uttered on a baseball field. I just thought
they won that game.
Tell that story. So,
and again, there has been a lot of Jewish. I mean, there's a lot of Jewish baseball players through the years. They just weren't all, Hall of Famers. As for boxing, there have been a ton. In fact, Jews in many ways dominated, especially the smaller divisions, for a very long time. We did have one heavyweight champion, Max Baer, who was the heavyweight champion in the 1930s. There was a very famous movie that won Best Picture called, what was the name of the movie? What was the name of the movie? It was about the guy the biggest underdog to win the heavyweight championship. They thought he was going to get killed by this great, fearsome boxer, and that boxer was Max Baer. It was called, I just forgot the name of the movie. But anyway, Max Baer wore a Jewish star on his shorts. And he's also famous because his son became Jethro in the Beverly Hillbillies. So he was an actor. And so that's pretty interesting. That giant guy. I don't know if he continued to be Jewish or not. The greatest Jewish boxer is a guy named Benny Leonard, who was considered one of the great, if lightweights of all time. Fought 210 times. Only lost, I think, but he only lost maybe 5 times his whole career. And he retired, the stock market crashed, and then he had to go back. And so a lot of his losses came after he had to go back into the ring. So obviously he died young. But another one would be Barney Ross, who was the first boxer to hold 3 division titles simultaneously. And of course, he was a great boxer. Of course, they fought people like later, he fought Jake, he lost to Henry Armstrong. He fought LaMotta. He fought Ray Robertson. And his father was a rabbi. Ted Kid Lewis was another great one, welterweight. The 4th greatest boxer, according to on the list, was Abe Attel. And again, he was a featherweight, so a very small guy, but he lost, I think, 10 times. However, probably more than half of those were he threw the fight because he made money. He bet on the other guy. Yeah. So he was known later for doing that quite a bit. So there's a famous scene in the movie about it. What was the name of the movie? There was about the 1980s where Arnold Rothstein asked Abe Attel, how many times did you lose? He said, for real or when I threw the fights? So again, they didn't make a lot of money back then. Battling Levinsky was a famous light heavyweight.
Benny Leonard.
Benny Leonard was the best, probably. He's one of the best all times. Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum.
Right. Yeah.
Who I saw box many times.
Yeah, he was. Oh, you saw? You saw Rosenblum fight? Nice.
He fought on television quite a bit.
Oh, right.
I used to watch on television at least twice a week.
And he was famous because he would slap instead of hit, which apparently was really worked for him. That's why they called him Slapsy. I never saw. I've seen. So and they had some good names like Battling Levinsky. I love that name. And the greatest boxer of the 16th and 17th century, a guy named Daniel Mendoza, was Jewish. Many people don't realize that. There's a couple of kids, Louis Kid Kaplan, Jack Kid Berg, Jackie Field. So there's really quite a number of them. And these are just the best. There were a lot of champions. In fact, a lot of people would go to the fights just to watch Jews fight Irish because that was a big deal. Who was the Jewish? This Irish guy was the great Jewish beater, and this Jewish guy was the great So they'd go to see these Jews fight the Irish. So,
wasn't there a Jewish heavyweight that fought against Joe Louis? Was there a Jewish heavyweight that fought against Joe Louis? I remember.
May have been. I don't know who. He didn't beat him.
No, he didn't beat him, but he got a lot of press.
Everybody fought against. Yeah, Louis had the Bum of the Month club.
Yeah,
so
I don't think Max
fought a lot of no names. Interesting with the Irish, one of the better Jewish boxers was Mushy Callahan, who was not Irish, he was Jewish.
That's awesome. And Max Baer lost to James J. Braddock. That was the name I could remember. The movie's The Cinderella Man. And James J. Braddock was a major underdog and knocked out Max Baer and then made one of the great deals of the century because he decided he would fight Joe Louis. There was a no-no. A black boxer could not become heavyweight champion. And after Jersey Joe Walcott, and he made a deal. He would fight Joe Louis, but he would get a percentage of Joe Louis's proceeds for the future, like for his future bouts, because he knew he was going to lose. And so that's what he did. So he made money off of Joe Louis by gave him the chance. And he obviously probably thought he was going to lose because Joe Louis was pretty unbeatable. He did lose one fight before he retired the first time. So, but he did fight a lot of bums. But again, there weren't that many people, and a lot of people probably didn't want to fight Joe Louis. I wouldn't want to fight Joe Louis. I know Jeff would want to because he's a lot tougher than I am, but I would never want to fight Joe Louis. So those are some of the boxers, but there's been a lot of other athletes. Will go. Anybody?
Yeah. Why don't we switch over to my favorite sport? Well, I don't know if it's a sport, entertainment, wrestling. And
Wrestling. Bill
Goldberg to this day still has a Legends contract. So what they call the Legends contract, when WWE, when nobody has anybody other talent, they'll bring Goldberg back because he is the one that drew all the crowds back in WCW.
That is awesome. So I don't know, except for Goldberg, I don't know any of the Jewish wrestlers, any other ones, Jonathan? Any other Jewish wrestlers?
Not that stand out like Bill Goldberg.
And Bill Goldberg also made the best deal of all time. I don't know if you guys realize, but wrestling obviously is fake in terms of they know who the winner is, but it exacts a terrible toll on your body. All these guys are dying in their 40s, early 50s from the steroids, from the, they jump from feet, they're thrown all over the place. So they die very young. So, and Jonathan, you'll have to tell me the specifics, but Goldberg was the number one wrestler for one of the wrestling groups. What was he, WWE or WCW? What was he?
Started in WCW, then WWE when WWE bought out WCW.
So he was the fighter for he was the number one fighter for WCW. WWE bought out WCW, and so they now had two staples of wrestlers. They had too many wrestlers because they had all the famous names. And so they went to Goldberg and said, we now own your contract. You have a 5-year contract with us. We want to pay you half what you're getting paid because we have too many wrestlers. And they said, if you refuse to take a pay cut, you're not going to be allowed to wrestle for the next 5 years. And Goldberg said, okay, and walked away. And so he got paid 5 years, got paid not to wrestle. So that's why he retired, because he was smart, because he got paid twice as much and didn't have any physical issues for all those 5 years. So that was what
but now he's on what they call a Legends contract. If they're in good shape, they can come back. So he's on a Legends contract. So he's got like maybe one more match in him. And I think that's it.
So that's pretty impressive. There's been some other famous Jewish athletes, obviously. One of my favorite stories, of course, is Agnes Coletti, along with Carrie Strug. I mean, Carrie Strug was great, but Coletti was better. She was one of the greatest gymnasts of all time, probably would have been the greatest gymnast of all time if she wasn't Jewish and it hadn't been in her prime during World War II. So she was one of the great Jewish, and remember, she's born in 1921, in January of 1921. So she's Hungarian. By the way, I think she's still alive. I think if she may be alive or just died, she was the oldest living Olympic champion last year. I don't know if she's still living, but she won 10 medals, 5 gold, 3 silver, and 2 bronze. But what's really interesting is she was a gymnast in Hungary, and she won the world championships 10 times from 1937 to 1956. So remember, she's born in 1921. That means she was a professional gymnast, a champion at age 35. Many gymnasts obviously retire before, most of the best gymnasts retire before they're 20. And so she's the oldest gymnast to win a gold medal, the oldest gymnast to win a world record, and men's or women's, I believe. And she was, of course, headed to the 1940 Olympics, which was canceled, and the 44 she would have gone. She was already world champion, but she was Jewish in Hungary, and we all know who took over Hungary.
Right.
So at first, she thought they weren't taking Jews to the camps if they were married, so she married another Jewish gymnast. Then found out that was not the case. So she had a forged card and pretended to be a Christian woman who was I think a seamstress, or she was a janitor. And during the war, pretending she was Christian, because she was already kicked out of her gymnastics club, by the way. She did go to the 1936 Olympics, but she was only 15. So she survived the world as a maid. That's what she was. Her mother and sister were saved by Wallenberg. Her father and all the other relatives were killed. And of course, she ends up in Hungary. And who takes over eventually?
The Russians.
Soviets. And so after the war, she becomes a professional cellist and goes back to the Olympics and goes to the 1948 Olympics and cannot compete because she's injured. So by this time, she's already 27, and she really, when people should be way after people retire. But then in 1952, at 31, she wins 4 medals, including a gold in the floor exercise, becomes the oldest woman to win an Olympic gold medal. And the 54, she wins a gold medal at the 1954 World Championships. She wins gold medals at the 1956 Olympics. So at 35, she has her best Olympics. She wins 6 medals, including 3 gold, and was considered the best athlete of the 1956 Olympics. However, the Soviets then take over Hungary during the 1956 Olympics. So she's at the Olympics in Australia when the Soviets invade her home country. And so what does she do? She seeks asylum in Australia and becomes a coach for the Australian Olympic team. Then she moves to Israel and ends up living out her life in Israel and becomes a coach of the Israeli national team. So this is a woman who is extraordinary. I mean, you think about the Olympics, I mean, they're 16, 17, 18-year-old girls, and she was 35 in the 1950s when she had her best Olympics after, being injured for one, couldn't serve because of 2 world wars, was very young for the first one. So pretty interesting. One of the most famous, most important Jewish athletes. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, Jeff.
Could I hear her name again, Rabbi?
Agnes, Agnes Coletti, Keleti. I'm surprised there hasn't been a movie made about her, because really an incredible, so if she was born January, she'd be 101 if she was alive at age 100. I don't know if she's still alive today. So it's 11. We can continue this next week because we didn't get to obviously football or basketball.
Right.
And the basketball, there was an incredible number of Jewish basketball players, hard to believe, in the 20s and 30s, and even in the 40s before it became a very popular sport. Obviously, we talked about Nat Holman, who was the coach of CCNY, coached the only team to ever win the NCAA championships and the NIT championships in the same year. He was also an original Celtic.
Right.
So we'll talk about, we'll push everything back and continue with, if everybody's okay with sports, although it may be boring some people, not everybody's as into sports.
Oh, no, I'd love to hear it.
But even in track and
Michael.
field, I'm sorry.
Michael, yeah,
I just wanted to go ahead, Larry.
For basketball, was Amari Steinberg the only one that converted to Judy, or was there others? I know he converted. Was there more?
that would be, and the more recent ones I'm not as familiar with. So there could be others. Basketball, I don't know, there's got to be someone we don't know. We tend to look at the famous ones, Tal Brody, Nat Holman, Red Auerbach, and Dalshay is probably the best, definitely the best Jewish basketball player.
Max Zaslavsky for the Knicks.
Oh, Max. Okay, good. There's going to be ones I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't pay attention to I don't watch sports anymore except for tennis and football. So my knowledge is
No, this was the old Knicks in the 1940s.
The 40s? Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, real old.
Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking about. Oh, yeah. Max. Yes. Oh, yeah. He was
two-hand set shot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Those.
Well,
so, actually, any other questions or thoughts? We'll go over that next week. I mean, there's been drag racers. There's been, racquetball players, football players. Obviously, we haven't even got to swimming. We're two of the greatest Jewish athletes. Of course, are swimmers.
Well, also coaches like Abe Saperstein
and coaches and owners of, I mean, when it comes to coaches, we could do, that would be.
Ali Sherman, I think, was a coach of the New York Giants, and he was the coach at Brooklyn College, which you don't think is a major football powerhouse. Jane's school, where she graduated.
It could be. I do not know. I've never been there. But again, there's also, Ryan Braun, Amari Stoudemire. There's some present ones I'm not as, there's Sue Bird. I was looking at some present ones I'm not so familiar with are really great ones. There's,
Rabbi,
yes.
I sent you an article about the leading scorer in basketball, men and women, this year in college basketball is an Orthodox Jew, goes to yeshiva. Now it's Division III, but the interesting thing was he was a Division I candidate. A lot of schools wanted him, but he wanted to continue his Jewish education, and he was Orthodox, so he went to yeshiva. He's just tearing up Division III, and he's the nation's leading scorer.
Wow, very cool.
I believe that yeshiva is number one in that division this year,
Now they're
or at least they were early in the year.
yeah, I think they're about number 5. There are a couple of real good Division III clubs, but they'll play for the national championship in Division III.
That's
Give
awesome.
you 2 quick names in football with family connections: Sid Luckman
Oh yeah,
That's
right. Of
the
course.
greatest-
and Al Davis.
Yeah, Al Davis.
Yeah.
I went
So
to
that-
school with
Sid
Al
Luckman is
Davis,
the
we were
greatest-
classmates.
Jewish football player. Obviously, he's a Hall of Fame quarterback. But I mean, again, there's been some great players, and some of them are obviously Jewish. Nancy Lieberman, one of the greatest female basketball players, is obviously Jewish. So we'll go over that. We'll go over some others like track and fields, where of course Harold Abrams is very famous, but because of the movie Chariots of Fire, which is based on his life and being a Jew and trying to professionalize sports. So we'll talk. Anybody seen Chariots of Fire? That could be your homework.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful
That's
picture.
famous.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
When I watched it the first time, I wasn't, I was a kid, so I wasn't really paying attention to the Jewish thing. But now, when I'm older, you can see it's it's hard to believe that movie won the Best Picture because it was a small movie, but it was such a great one. So, well, thanks, guys. So we did the Maccabi games, we did some sports. Noel, did you have a question, or are you saying goodbye?
You're on mute. No.
You're on mute, Noel. And sorry, sometimes I can't see your hand up because I don't. Well, we'll see if you can figure out how to get it. We'll next week we'll continue Jews in sports and some of the interesting backstories, not just the records. We know about Mark Spitz, but we don't know about all the other things that went through his life, and people like Red Auerbach and the original Celtics. I mean, some really interesting Jews and Jewish characters. So bring anyone you know of, because I don't know a lot of them, especially they're modern. So Jonathan, I know, is keeping up with basketball and baseball, which I don't right now. So everyone stay safe. And remember, there is more than a little pamphlet on Jewish athletes.